Hello everybody and welcome to our series of podcasts on ethology. For exactly today we have planned a face-to-face conference, which of course is only worth mentioning under the conditions we have now. This is Andrea Allerkamp from the Europa University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder and me, Associate Director at the Internationale Kolleg Morphomata. The plans for this go back to my habilitation on a literary ethology around 1800. But they became more concrete after I got to know Andrea Allerkamp, and things developed during a fellowship that brought her to Cologne last year. Under the leitmotif of claims and limits of a lost discipline, the Ethology project was planned as a conference in which an interdisciplinary assessment of the lost discipline of behavioral research between ethics and ontology, anthropology and its critique, between ecology and the history of science was to be carried out. The contact and travel restrictions in the context of the corona pandemic have made new planning necessary. A series of podcasts in audio-video replaces the face-to-face event. It is a substitute and we will see how we can make the best out of the situation. First, we will start today with a double header, that is, with introduction by myself and a second input with a conversation featuring Andrea and me. We are very pleased that quite a number of contributors have followed our idea and will make presentations on ethology available here over the summer semester from today until July 16th. The time is always the same, Thursdays 5 p.m. Central European Time. The podcasts will be available for listening and or viewing. My introductory section offers two parts. A general one with questions and possible directions of inquiries, and a second one which gives room to the assumption that mythological knowledge is organized by the concept of distraction, Zerstreuung, in both the meaning of diversion or distraction in the sense of a certain kind of entertainment, and in this respect a getting away from oneself, and in the meaning of being absent-minded while focusing on something that is not there in the outer world, but somewhere inside. That is something you can only reach by your own inner touch. First, questions. Let me give you a brief idea what this project about a so-called lost discipline is about. When the Werner Reimer organized a colloquium on human ethology in 1977, it was even about claims and limits of a new discipline. Human ethology, this was an attempt to transfer behavioral biology from Jakob von Uexküll to Konrad Lorenz, from the field of biology and in particular the description of animal behavior, to humans and thus to social science paradigms. Ethology, after all, has not been able to establish itself as a new meta-science of man. Nevertheless, the anti-behaviorist thrust of ethology could give impulses for an anthropological field of research that had begun to move between philosophical anthropology from Plessner to Portman, empirical ethnological anthropologies, and a radical questioning of the primacy of anthropological knowledge, from Hegel's philosophy of history to the debate about the end of man initiated by Michel Foucault. However, the attempt at the end of the 1970s to analyze, I quote from the Reimers project, the relations between biological evolution and cultural evolution as precisely as possible, end of quote, seemed to assume a biological reductionism that lagged behind the dawn of life research, Aufbruch der Lebensforschung, already called for by Adolf Portman in 1965. Does nature release man, entlässt die Natur den Menschen, 1970, was Portman's polemical question about a semiology that attempts to detach the relationship between nature and culture, body and mind from the alternative determinism versus freedom. The religious historian Walter Burkerts recognized this desideratum in the conceptualization of ethology early on, when he attempted to justify the ethological accent semiologically in his 1979 Ritual Studies. As Burkerts makes clear, there are no signs without signification, and signification is void without reference. No sign exists that is not according to the possibilities of its comprehensibility, signification, and is thus, as form, embedded in behavior, life. Since the 1980s, the fact that the concept of ethology is associated with fundamental questions about the forms of human action and co-living, and in particular about generalizability or a semiology of knowledge about them, has come to the fore, especially from questions of a philosophy of immanence. And thus, Jean-Luc Nancy demanded an Ethologie de l'être avec, an ethology of being with, which determines the existence of each individual human being in the horizon of his communality, and sees the conditions as well as the possibilities of his cultural action in coexistence, that is to say, the negotiations, limitations and extensions of a plural field of action. Following the ethology of Jacob von Uexküll, Gilles Deleuze decidedly conceived his ethology as an immanent plan of the bodies and their movements in space. Deleuze refers here to Spinoza's ethics, which can neither be understood as classical ontology nor as ethics in the sense of a moral philosophy, but rather as a fundamental meaning of ethology. Questions of the form or structure of a body cannot be separated here from its capabilities as well as from the forces that inhibit it. I quote Deleuze, "A coherence cannot be separated from its ability to become affected." Such approaches to formulating the problem of ethology can not only be applied to current research discussions such as, so elaborated above all by Giorgio Agamben, that of a form inherent in life, as demonstrated by the example of monastic forms of life, or the concept of life knowledge conceived in analogy to the phenomenological world of life, as demonstrated by the former postgraduate program Life Forms and Life Knowledge in Frankfurt-Oder, but also raise a number of historical and systematic questions. 1. About the importance of ethological approaches for a theory of the subject or subjective action. 2. About the relationship of ethology to empirical anthropologies on the one hand and philosophical anthropology on the one hand. 3. About the affinity of the arts and literature to an ethology, that is to say, on the one hand, according to an ethological understanding of the arts as an ensemble of forces, and on the other hand, according to the extent to which an ethology falls back in a special way on aesthetic modes of representation. 4. About the demarcations of ethology as body knowledge to poetologies of knowledge. 5. About the importance of ethological approaches for individual specialist disciplines. 6. About an ethological understanding of public spirit, community and plurality, thus the valence of ethology for an understanding of the political and of democracy. 7. About the importance of ethology for a deconstruction of Christianity, Nancy, or a genuinely immanent time dimension of bodies, Deleuze. 8. About the cultural significance of ethology for an understanding of continuity and discontinuity of cultural figurations, as well as more generally the time dimension and future openness of ethology. 9. About the conceptualizations of movement in the image, of process in the body, as well as the diagrammatic forms of recording movement. 10. About life knowledge, between persistence, process, and future, what is yet to come. 11. About the reception of Spinoza, particularly in the context of early Romanticism, Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schlegel, Schelling, and in opposition to, and in part also in direct reference to, Kantian philosophy. 12. About the history of ethology, from its beginnings as characterology to the behavioral paradigms of the 20th century, and its relationship to neighboring disciplines from anthropology to cybernetics. In addition to taking stock of a disparate field of research that is still systematically underdeveloped, the main focus is on impulses that can have an impact on the various disciplines based on ethological approaches, and in particular on updating a research approach that, by addressing the questions of life and knowledge, form and force, persistence and temporal process, directs attention to the fact that especially in the arts there are already forms of representation in which the singularity of the work and the potentially infinite reception, hence its hypothetical generality, have become Zeitgestalt. But to what extent can works of art actually offer model forms, matrices of human life and the control of uncertain futures? I come to my second part on distraction. In his essay on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which has become classic, Walter Benjamin described the spectator in the cinema as a distracted examiner, because he cannot capture the flow of images in the dark cave of the cinema, but, on the contrary, his attention is constantly and unstoppably, because there is no other focus, controlled and distracted by the change of images. He or she is both attentive and distracted. Simplified, one can recognize here a more complex concept of distraction which blurs two facets into one another. The distracted walk out into the world, to the marketplace of fairground, losing oneself on the one hand, and on the other hand, the absent-minded turning away from the externalities of sensory perception, when the sense loses itself and the thought turns inward in a focused way, as one imagines from a philosopher who is lost in his own thoughts. Benjamin's consideration of media technology shows itself sharpened in the modern form of experience. It aims, however, more fundamentally at an ethological problem. It arises from the question of how community and future action can be founded in a knowledge dispositive. What does the individual know beyond him or herself? And if one wants to intensify the question, what does an individual action or situation, a singular will, a force vector, know beyond the limits of its effect? Heinrich von Kleist, one of the most important German authors of the Romantic era, who at the same time can hardly be attributed to any of the currents of the time around 1800, has early in his lifetime understood this question as the failure of his life plan, Lebensplan. The crisis symptoms that result from this, with Kleist's formula of the fragile institution of the world, gebrechliche Einrichtung der Welt, represent only one side of Kleist's experimental writing. For Kleist's texts represent tentative experiments, testings in the relation of language and body. For example, when Kleist imagines that his thoughts are only gradually formed while speaking, allmähliche Verfertigung der Gedanken beim Reden. In other words, they arise from and in reaction to the imponderables of a conversation or of circumstances that can be connected with linguistic interaction. Language and its use, the abandonment of oneself to it, thus also becomes an incalculable risk, so that the young man in the exam Kleist asks to consider, but can expect that the examiners themselves will have to fear the exam situation even more, since they are exposed to the same contingency, only with a more eminent drop. This is a thought that distracts. In his text on the puppet theatre, which only became classical decades later, Kleist, his first-person narrator, sends a certain Mr. C, the first dancer in the opera, into such testing scenarios. The paradoxes that the text claims to present, the dance of the marionettes, the puppets, is necessarily much more graceful than that of any human being, because they are antigrave. That is, they are pulled by threads, are always held in flowing motion by an invisible force, and never have to touch the ground. Accompanied by secondary considerations concerning the prothetic armament of man as a puppet, using the example of amputated limbs that are to be replaced, which conjure up the Napoleonic wartime, the text intensifies the character when it confronts Mr. C in a duel with a fencing bear, in which the animal does not fall for any feint of the experienced fencer Mr. C, as if it could read in its soul, in seiner Seele lesen könnte. The fact that God and limp man, God and marionette, infinite or non-existent consciousness, God and Liedermann, appear as two equal opponents in a world play that seemed to be based on the philosophy of history. One, God, cannot be mistaken because he knows everything. The other, the bear, the animal, cannot be mistaken because it knows nothing about deception. This may already give cause for thought. However, the first-person narrator in Kleist's on the puppet theatre does not understand this potential for reflection as one that could be attentively grasped, recognized and applied. Therefore, as said a little distracted, would we have to eat from the tree of knowledge again in order to fall back into the state of innocence? Here it is again, the figure of distracted knowledge. But absent-minded means here precisely not to follow Mr. C's path, but to let the film of the story run to its conclusion every time, because the viewer simply remains seated or leaves the cinema to find him or herself in another movie. Here, the subject has disappeared from the world stage, Hegel's world theatre radically opposed. Indeed, the world stage itself seems to be perspectivated and multiplied, infinitely shifted as in a system of dark corridors and caves, which may remind us of Kafka's tale of Dabei, and perhaps of the ethology of the Mille Plateaux of Deleuze and Guattari. Is it now legitimate to use a text from more than 200 years ago, of which it is not even certain that it is properly understood as a theoretical essay, for the purposes of an interdisciplinary question? What would be if this question could also only be played over from one cinema hall to the other, without a central perspective of knowledge being able to put the viewer into an overall picture? What if God and Liedermann in Walter Benjamin's reading, these would probably be theology on the one hand and historical materialism on the other, aimed at without anyone knowing how to act better? Intentional acting and behavior, the autonomous subject and man as junction of determined causal chains, both do not name here sufficient anthropological concepts. Observation is no longer a passive concept here. The question of the outer world and the inner world are open to each other. Questions of anthropology and its critique, of how a classical ontology is changed into questions of life forms, the relationship between observation or observator and ecology, between biology and philosophy, all these are of systematic importance for an ethology. Thanks everybody for contributing, thanks to all of you for participating even in your own place at home, and thanks for being with us in this nearby distance, this faraway, distracted common ground for new perspectives on ethology. Thank you very much.